year was 1874, and the Arizona Territory stretched out like a land still deciding whether it wanted to be lived in. The wind carried dust and silence across miles of cactus and stone, where even the sun seemed to hang a little lower, watching the earth with suspicion. In the heart of that rugged wilderness sat the town of Whitestone Crossing, a scatter of wooden buildings, a church with a leaning steeple, and a single main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. It wasn't much of a town, but for the settlers who had carved it from the desert, it was home, and for Clara Whitfield, 19 years old and restless, it was both a prison and a promise. Clara's father, Elias Whitfield, had come west after the war, chasing land and the idea of peace. He'd built their homestead with his own hands, splitting timber until his palms were a map of scars. To him, life was a thing to be earned through sweat and fear of God. He expected the same from his daughter. Her mother, Ruth, had died of fever when Clara was 12, leaving behind only a few faded books, a silver cross, and a wild-spirited daughter who didn't always know when to hold her tongue. Clara was tall for a girl, with sunburned skin and hair the color of late-harvest wheat. Her hands were rough from work, yet she moved with quiet grace, something she never noticed but others did. She rose before dawn to feed the chickens, fetched water from the well, and baked biscuits for the men who worked her father's fields. But when her chores were done, she would often climb the ridge behind the house to watch the horizon turn gold. From there, she could almost pretend she was free. The townsfolk respected the Whitfields, or perhaps they simply feared Elias's temper. He was a man of iron rules. No backtalk, no shirking work, and no questions about the Apaches who camped beyond the northern ridge. They're not to be trusted, he'd warn. They smile one day and raid the next. But Clara had never seen the Apache as monsters. As a child, she had watched them from afar, riders moving like shadows across the plains, their horses swift and sure. She'd once found a carved stone left near the creek, smooth as river glass with a feather etched on its surface. She kept it hidden in her apron pocket, a secret that made her feel oddly protected. Life in Whitestone Crossing followed a rhythm set by sun and survival. Sundays were for church and gossip, Mondays for mending fences. When news came from the east, it arrived weeks late and half true. The people there believed they were holding the line of civilization, taming the wild, one fence post at a time. But to Clara, it often felt like the land was taming them instead. Still, there were moments of beauty. In the spring, when desert blooms burst from the red soil, the air filled with color, bright yellows and deep purples that seemed too soft for such a hard place. On those days, Clara would pause in her chores just to breathe it in. Yet even then, the horizon held a quiet warning, the promise that peace never lasted long on the frontier. The older men in town often spoke in low tones about broken treaties and cattle raids. Sometimes at night, Clara would hear distant drums echoing from the hills. Her father would curse and load his rifle. "They're restless again," he'd mutter. But to Clara, the sound wasn't threatening, it was haunting, almost sad, like a heartbeat in the dark. As her 19th birthday passed without mention, Clara began to sense that her life was no longer hers to shape. Suitors had called before, awkward boys smelling of tobacco and dust, but Elias had refused them all. He said no man was good enough yet, but lately Clara had noticed him meeting privately with the town elders, his face grim, his words clipped. Something was being decided, something she wasn't meant to know. That night, as the wind howled through the shutters and coyotes cried in the distance, Clara sat by the dying fire and traced the carved feather on her hidden stone. She didn't know why she kept it close, only that it felt like a promise. In a land where everything was owned by someone, the water, the cattle, the land, it was the one thing that still belonged entirely to her. Whitestone Crossing had always lived in a state of uneasy balance, part settlement, part shadow. The townspeople liked to say they'd carved civilization out of the desert, but the truth was that the desert tolerated them more than it welcomed them. Every fence they built, every road they cleared, was a quiet act of defiance against the land and those who had called it home long before the first wagon wheel ever creaked over it. The Apache people still roamed the nearby hills, their camps scattered along the riverbeds and canyons north of town. To most settlers, they were a constant threat, a rumor of danger that flared with every missing horse or smoke seen on the horizon. But to others, like Clara, they were a mystery, wrapped in stories that didn't always sound true. When the trading post burned that spring, Suspicion spread faster than the fire itself. Men gathered outside the saloon, their rifles leaning against the walls, muttering about revenge. Clara had watched from the window of her father's store as Marshal Dugan tried to calm them. "We don't know who did it," he'd said. "Could have been bandits, could have been lightning." But nobody listened. To the people of Whitestone Crossing, it was easier to believe in an enemy they already feared. Tension became the town's second language. Men carried rifles into the fields. Mothers kept their children close. The church bell rang more often, not for worship but for meetings and warnings, and then word came that a peace council was being arranged between the settlers and the Apache, a final attempt to end the years of raids, thefts, and blood. The territorial governor had sent a representative to oversee it, and everyone in Whitestone Crossing was expected to show goodwill. Elias Whitfield didn't like it. He said peace was just another word for surrender. But he also knew that another raid could destroy the town entirely, so he swallowed his pride and attended the council, bringing Clara along, though she didn't understand why until much later. The meeting took place in a dry riverbed just outside town. The air was thick with heat and mistrust. On one side stood the townsfolk, boots dusty, eyes narrow, hands near their gun belts. On the other, a small group of Apache men and women, proud and silent, their faces unreadable. Among them stood Nantan, a young warrior said to be the son of a respected tribal elder. He wore no feathers or beads, only a simple buckskin shirt and a carved pendant around his neck. When he spoke, his English was clear and calm. "We do not seek more war," he said. "But peace is not made with words alone. It is made with trust." The interpreter's voice trembled as he translated, but the meaning was unmistakable. The Apaches were offering peace, if the settlers would accept it. After hours of arguing, the council ended without resolution. The townsfolk left angry and uneasy, muttering that the Apaches wanted too much. Yet something had shifted that day, something Clara couldn't name. She'd watched Nantan as he spoke, his voice steady even as the men around him whispered and scoffed. When his eyes met hers, she felt a strange stillness, as if the noise around them had suddenly fallen away. Days turned into weeks, and rumors grew. Some said the Apaches demanded land. Others said they wanted an exchange, a symbolic bond to seal the peace between the two sides. Clara didn't understand what that meant until she overheard her father talking with the town elders late one night. "They want a union," Elias said bitterly, "a marriage between one of ours and one of theirs." A show of good faith. "Who?" someone asked. Elias's pause said everything. When Clara's name was finally spoken, it was not as a daughter's, but as a bargaining chip. She froze behind the barn wall, her breath caught in her throat. Her father's voice was hard, but it wavered when he spoke again. "If it spares bloodshed, maybe it's the Lord's will." Clara stumbled away into the darkness, her heart pounding louder than the wind. The town she'd known her whole life suddenly felt foreign, filled with strangers wearing familiar faces. That night, Whitestone Crossing slept under the illusion of calm, but every heart in town beat faster with fear of what might come next. And far out in the desert, a single Apache drum began to sound, slow, steady, echoing across the land like the beginning of a storm. The next morning dawned dry and gray, the kind of day when even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. The desert was still, save for the distant cry of a hawk and the wind whispering through brittle sagebrush. In Whitestone Crossing, however, stillness was an illusion. Beneath the calm, the town was holding its breath. Inside the Whitfield home, the air was heavier than the heat outside. Clara moved quietly through the kitchen, pretending not to notice the tension that had settled in the house like smoke. Her father sat at the table, his Bible open but unread, the lines around his mouth drawn tight. When she placed his coffee before him, he didn't look up. "Pa," she said softly. He took a long moment before answering. "We're doing the Lord's work, Clara, you understand that?" She frowned. "What work?" He finally looked at her then, his eyes cold and tired. "The council met again last night. They've decided the peace will hold, but only if there's a show of good faith." Clara's heart began to pound. "A show of good faith?" He hesitated, then said the words she'd been dreading. "You'll be part of it." For a moment she thought she hadn't heard him right. Then, as his meaning settled, her throat closed. "You can't mean it's been agreed," he said sharply. "A marriage between you and one of their men." That's the price of peace. Clara's breath caught. You're giving me away like a— Enough! He snapped, slamming his hand on the table. You'll do as you're told. This isn't about you, Clara. It's about keeping this town safe, keeping what's ours. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but the steel in his tone left no room for argument. She wanted to shout, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. She turned away, blinking back tears. Outside, the town buzzed with whispers. Some pitied her, some sneered, and others called it a noble act of sacrifice. Yet beneath their words lay curiosity and fear. No one dared say it aloud, but every soul in Whitestone Crossing wondered what kind of man would agree to such a marriage. 2 days later, she found out. The wedding was to take place on neutral ground, the same dry riverbed where the council had met. A line of soldiers stood watch, their blue uniforms bright against the red earth. The settlers gathered on one side, the Apaches on the other. Between them stood the interpreter, and beside him, the man who was to be her husband, Nantan. He looked different than Clara remembered, calmer, though there was something fierce in his eyes that the crowd seemed to sense. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his long black hair tied loosely behind him. Around his neck hung the same carved pendant she'd seen before, a symbol she didn't yet understand. As the sun climbed higher, the ceremony began. It was simple. Words translated, vows spoken, the rustle of skirts and murmurs among the crowd. Clara's hands trembled as she stood beside Nantan, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the priest's words. When he reached for her hand, his touch was surprisingly gentle. He said nothing, but his grip was steady, as if trying to anchor her against the storm of stares around them. When it was done, the priest announced them husband and wife. A ripple of unease moved through the settlers. Some refused to look. Others turned away in silent disapproval. Then came the final act, the exchange of gifts. Elias Whitfield stepped forward, offering a small pouch of silver coins, a token of respect. In return, Nantan nodded once and spoke softly to the interpreter. His words were brief, but they made the crowd murmur. He says, the interpreter explained, that his gift will come in 2 days' time, something he has made with his own hands. That only deepened the whispers. What kind of gift would an Apache bring? Clara didn't know what to expect or whether to dread it. But as she looked up at the man beside her, she caught something in his expression, not triumph, not defiance, but quiet resolve. For the first time since the council's decision, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was a spark, small and strange, that whispered of change. As the crowd dispersed, the wind picked up, scattering dust and whispers alike. The deal was struck, the marriage sealed. And though peace had been promised, every person there knew that something far greater and far more dangerous had just begun. The 2 days that followed were the longest of Clara Whitfield's life. She rose before dawn and moved through her chores in silence, her thoughts scattered and sharp as glass. The house felt emptier than ever. Her father rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were heavy with the finality of someone who had already convinced himself he was right. Outside, Whitestone Crossing moved like a hive disturbed. People stared when she passed. Some whispered pity, others disapproval. A few, the cruelest, whispered fascination, as though her fate were a story meant to entertain. By the morning of the second day, Clara had decided to leave. She didn't know where she'd go, maybe north toward the mountains or east, back to the rail line. But she couldn't stay and become a symbol for peace she hadn't chosen. She packed a small bag, her mother's Bible, the silver cross and the carved stone with the feather she'd kept hidden all these years. She was tying her cloak when she heard her father's boots on the porch. "You best unpack that," Elias said without raising his voice. He didn't have to. His tone was enough. "Pa, please," she said. "You can't make me do this." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window toward the desert. "You think I want this for you? You think I'd hand my daughter to one of them if I had another choice?" Clara swallowed hard. "Then don't." He turned to face her, his eyes fierce and desperate. "You don't understand, girl. If this peace fails, they'll come for us all. The army won't save us. The governor won't send men for a town this small. This marriage might be the only thing standing between Whitestone and a graveyard." His voice trembled at the end, and for the first time, Clara saw the fear behind his anger. He wasn't being cruel. He was terrified. But that didn't make it easier to forgive him. When the sun reached its peak, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Riders. The Apaches were coming, and with them, her future. The town gathered again in silence, lining the edge of Main Street as Nantan and 3 others rode in. The horses moved in perfect rhythm, their hooves soft against the dry ground. Nantan dismounted first, his movements calm, deliberate. He didn't bow, but he offered a brief nod to Elias before turning toward Clara. He carried something wrapped in cloth, the promised wedding gift. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Nantan approached her, stopping a few feet away. His gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, but not unkind. "You will come to my home," he said slowly, his English careful but clear. "You will be safe." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced even the whispers behind her. Clara looked up, searching his face for mockery or pride, but found neither. There was only quiet strength, the kind of calm that didn't come from arrogance but from certainty. She managed a small nod. "And my father?" "He is your father," Nantan said. "That will not change." Then he unwrapped the cloth and revealed what he had brought, a cradle board beautifully carved from cedar and decorated with intricate symbols. The sight of it drew a collective gasp from the crowd. The workmanship was exquisite, inlaid silver patterns, delicate beadwork, and, at the center, a carving of a single feather surrounded by a circle of stars. Clara's hand flew to her pocket, where the small carved stone rested. Nantan saw her movement and smiled faintly. "You found one of mine," he said quietly, almost to himself. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. Some muttered that it was a trick, others stared in awe. But even the most skeptical could see the truth. This was no weapon, no token of savagery. It was art, grace, and respect made visible. Nantan lifted the cradle board slightly. "This is my gift," he said, "for the woman who will be my wife, and for the mother she lost." The air seemed to stop. Even Elias's face softened, his jaw slack with shock. No one spoke. No one dared. Clara felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning. Somehow this man, the one she'd been told to fear, had reached across a wall of hatred and found the one thing that still tethered her heart. Her mother's memory. For the first time, she didn't see him as a stranger, but as someone who had looked at her and truly seen her. The cradle board gleamed in the sunlight, its carvings alive with meaning. And in that moment, the town of Whitestone Crossing, so full of pride, fear, and judgment, fell completely, utterly silent. The morning of the wedding rose red, the kind of red that warned of dust storms or worse. The air was thick with heat and every sound seemed sharper, the world holding its breath. Even the church bell, when it rang, seemed to echo with unease. Clara stood before the cracked mirror in her small bedroom, staring at the pale reflection of a girl she barely recognized. Her wedding dress, if it could be called that, and was simple, white muslin pressed and mended at the seams. Her hair, usually loose around her shoulders, was braided tightly by Mrs. Ellis from the general store, who whispered hymns under her breath as she worked. "Keep your chin up, dear," Mrs. Ellis murmured. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Clara didn't answer. The words felt hollow, like a prayer spoken too late. Outside, the town gathered again in the dry riverbed, the same place where everything had begun. Half the town came out to see it, some out of curiosity, others to witness what they thought was madness. The men stood with their hats low, the women clutched their shawls, and the children whispered questions their mothers refused to answer. At the edge of the clearing, a small group of Apache men and women waited in silence. They were dressed simply but with quiet dignity, their faces calm, unreadable. Among them stood Nantan, his dark hair tied back, his eyes focused but still. He wore no ornaments this time, save for the carved pendant that never left his neck. When Clara arrived with her father, the murmurs began again. She could feel every stare like a pinprick against her skin. Elias Whitfield kept his hand on her arm, not in comfort but in control. The preacher, a gaunt man with trembling hands, cleared his throat and began. His words floated over the crowd, but Clara barely heard them. Her heart beat in her ears, loud and frantic. The language of vows and obedience blurred into nothing. When the time came for her to take Nantan's hand, she hesitated. It wasn't fear of him exactly, and it was fear of everything that came after. The life she was leaving behind, the one she couldn't yet imagine ahead. Nantan didn't move. He waited, patient, his gaze steady but not forceful. There was something in his stillness that steadied her too. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and sure, grounding her in a way she didn't expect. "Do you accept this man as your husband?" the preacher asked. Clara opened her mouth, but her voice caught. For a moment she thought she couldn't speak. Then softly, so softly only the front row might have heard her, she said, "I do." The words fell like pebbles into a deep well, rippling outward through the silence. When it was done, the preacher closed his book and stepped back. "By the eyes of God and this community," he said, "you are now husband and wife." No one clapped. No one smiled. The air was heavy, the moment suspended between disbelief and disapproval. Then, without a word, Nantan reached into the satchel beside him and lifted the cradle board, the same gift he had shown her days before. He held it up before the crowd, its carvings glowing in the sunlight. "This is for her," he said, his voice steady, "to honor her mother. To show peace between us." The murmuring stopped. Every head turned toward him. The intricate patterns caught the light, revealing details no one had noticed before. Tiny crosses, stars, and flowers, blending Apache and Christian symbols in perfect harmony. Elias Whitfield's face softened. The preacher for once said nothing. Even the wind seemed to pause. Nantan turned to Clara, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "This is not a cage," he said. "It is a beginning." Clara blinked hard, tears stinging her eyes. She nodded once, not in acceptance of her fate, but in recognition of something deeper. A truth she hadn't expected to find in this man or this moment. As they walked away together, whispers followed them, some filled with wonder, others with bitterness. But no one could deny what they had seen. An act of grace from a man they had been taught to fear. The ceremony might have begun in unease, but it ended in silence, the kind that comes not from fear, but from awe. The wedding should have ended at the riverbed, with the preacher's blessing and the town's reluctant silence. But Nantan had promised a gift, and gifts in the desert carried meaning deeper than words. As the crowd began to disperse, he lifted the cradle board again, turning it slowly in the sunlight so the carvings caught the glow like fire over water. Clara stood beside him, unsure what to say. She'd never seen anything so beautiful. The cedar gleamed smooth and golden, polished to a mirror sheen. The patterns danced across its surface, spirals and feathers, stars and crosses, woven together with such care that one design seemed to grow out of another. It was not just art, it was a story. Nantan spoke, his English quiet but sure. "This," he said, "is made from the tree that stands by your home, the one that grows beside the creek." Clara's breath caught. You cut it?" He shook his head. "No, it had fallen in the storm. I asked your father if I might take it." He said yes. Elias, standing nearby, blinked in surprise. He hadn't realized what that request had been for. Nantan continued. "Your mother planted that tree, yes? I was told she cared for it every spring. She gave it life. I wish to give it new life, as this." The word settled over the crowd like a hush. He traced the carvings with one hand as he spoke. "Here," he said, pointing to a small circle of stars. "This is the night sky, the path we all walk beneath. And this," he gestured to a feather carved near the center, "is for her spirit. To show that even when life ends, it does not leave. It becomes part of what comes next." Clara's eyes filled before she could stop them. No one in town had ever spoken of her mother with such tenderness, not even her father. Ruth Whitfield's name had faded into silence after her death, a name whispered only in grief. Yet somehow this man, this stranger from a people her town had called enemies, had reached across that silence and honored her memory more beautifully than anyone ever had. The cradle board wasn't just for show. It was meant for a child, a promise of life, of continuation. And though the meaning was startling, the gesture was unmistakable. He was offering her peace, not possession. The crowd didn't know how to respond. The women stared, some with tears, others with suspicion. The men shifted awkwardly, their certainty cracking. Marshal Dugan removed his hat as if standing before something sacred. Even the preacher, who had muttered disapproval at the start, was struck speechless. Elias Whitfield stood rigid, torn between pride and shame. He had agreed to this union out of desperation, believing it a sacrifice. But now, as he looked at his daughter beside the man he had feared, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not submission, but respect. Nantan turned then and faced the settlers. "This is not my way alone," he said, his voice carrying across the riverbed. "It is yours too. The feather, the cross, and they belong together. There is no peace unless both can stand side by side." No one answered. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Then Nantan looked to Clara again. "This is yours," he said softly, holding the cradle board out to her. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The wood was warm from the sun, smooth beneath her fingertips. She traced the feather at its center, and for a moment she imagined her mother's hand guiding her own. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. Nantan inclined his head. "You honor me by accepting it." The wind stirred then, lifting dust and the faint scent of cedar. Somewhere a hawk cried high above, a lonely sound that echoed across the vast silence. When Clara looked up, she saw the faces of her neighbors, quiet, uncertain, changed. The same men who had scoffed at the idea of peace now stood still, their anger dimmed by something they couldn't quite name. And in that fragile silence, the town of Whitestone Crossing, so long divided by fear, was, for the first time, joined by wonder. The gift had done what no treaty, sermon, or weapon could. It had reminded them that grace could come from the most unexpected hands. For the first time in its short, stubborn history, Whitestone Crossing fell completely silent. After the wedding, no one spoke as the crowd drifted back toward town. The only sounds were the creak of wagon wheels and the wind brushing over the dry grass. It wasn't the silence of peace, and not yet, but of confusion, of something too large to fit into words. That night the saloon stayed half empty. The usual laughter and poker games never started. Men sat at their tables nursing whiskey, staring at the wood grain as if searching for answers there. The women, who usually filled the evening air with gossip, stayed home. The few who did speak did so in whispers, low, uncertain, and full of wonder. Mrs. Ellis told her husband she'd never seen anything like it. "That man," she said, shaking her head. "He didn't act proud or cruel, he acted decent." Her husband grunted, unwilling to agree but unable to argue. At the Whitfield house, the air was heavier still. Clara sat by the window, the cradle board resting on her lap. The firelight flickered across its carvings, bringing the stars and feathers to life. She traced them with her fingers, half expecting they might vanish if she blinked. Her father sat at the table, pretending to read his Bible but turning no pages. The lamplight cast hard shadows across his face. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "You think he meant it?" Clara looked up. "Meant what?" "That talk about peace, about your mother," she hesitated. "Yes, I do." Elias exhaled slowly, setting the Bible down. For the first time since the council's decision, he looked smaller. Not weaker, but weary in a way that came from years of holding the world on his shoulders. "I wanted to protect you," he said quietly. "Didn't think it'd look like this." "I know," she said. And she meant it. He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the table. "You'll be leaving tomorrow." Her heart gave a small, frightened jump. She had known it was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real. "His people live 2 days' ride north," Elias continued. "He said he'll take you there. You'll have a home, a new start, a new start." The words sounded both hopeful and cruel. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat awake, watching the moonlight crawl across the walls. When she finally rose, it was not from fear, but from something else, a quiet determination she hadn't felt before. At dawn, the town gathered again, but this time the crowd was smaller. Only a handful came to see her off. Mrs. Ellis with a bundle of bread, Marshal Dugan standing stiffly by his horse, and a few others who came not out of duty but out of guilt. When Nantan arrived, he came alone, his horse carrying 2 saddlebags and a blanket rolled neatly behind the saddle. He greeted no one, only nodded respectfully before turning to Clara. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked back once toward her home, the small cabin, the corral, the tree stump by the creek where the fallen trunk once lay. Then she nodded. "I'm ready." Elias stepped forward, awkward and stiff. For a moment it seemed he might speak, but no words came. He only placed his hand on her shoulder and gave a short nod. Permission, farewell, apology all at once. Clara's throat tightened. "Goodbye, Pa." "Go on then," he murmured, and with that, She mounted the horse behind Nantan. The townsfolk watched in silence as the two figures rode north, their outlines shrinking against the pale horizon. No one said a word. No one jeered. No one blessed them either. They simply watched. The kind of watching that happens when people realize they've just witnessed something that will linger long after they're gone. That afternoon, as the dust from their horses faded into the heat shimmer, Mrs. Ellis stood on her porch, her apron fluttering in the wind. "You think she'll be all right?" someone asked. Mrs. Ellis shaded her eyes, looking toward the distant hills. "I think," she said softly, "she already is." In a town built on fear, silence was rare. But for the first time, that silence wasn't heavy. It was reverent. Whitestone Crossing had lost a daughter, but in her courage, they'd seen the faintest glimmer of something stronger than hatred: hope. The journey north took 2 long days under a relentless Arizona sun. The land grew wilder with every mile, red mesas rising like fortresses, canyons opening beneath the horses' hooves, the sky so wide it made Clara feel both small and free. They spoke little at first. Nantan rode ahead, silent except when he pointed out a stream or stopped to let her drink. He moved with an ease that made the desert seem less cruel. She watched the way he read the land, how his eyes caught movement she could never see, how he found water where she saw only dust. On the second evening, they camped near a dry wash lined with mesquite trees. The sun melted behind the rocks, turning the world copper and gold. Nantan built a small fire and handed her a strip of dried venison. Clara sat across from him, the flames dancing between them. "You've hardly said a word since we left," she said quietly. He looked up from his work, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I did not think you wanted words." She blinked, then laughed softly despite herself. "Maybe I didn't." For a long time they sat in silence, not uncomfortable but new. She found herself studying him in the flicker of firelight, the sharp lines of his face, the calm steadiness in his movements. He carried no air of superiority, no demand for obedience. He seemed balanced. Finally, she asked, "Why the cradle board?" Nantan set down the knife he'd been using to shape a stick. "It is the first thing a man makes when he takes a wife," he said. "It means he wishes for life, not for himself, but for what will come after." Clara lowered her gaze. "But you don't even know me," he nodded. "No, not yet. But peace must begin somewhere. A gift can be a bridge." His words were simple, yet they struck something deep in her chest. He reached for the cradle board, which she had carried wrapped carefully in cloth. "Look here," he said, pointing to a carving near the top. "This is you." She leaned closer. The pattern was of flowing lines like water, meeting at a circle surrounded by stars. "You are the river," he explained. "The one that crosses our land and yours. It does not belong to either side, yet both need it to live." Clara traced the design with her finger, her throat tightening. "And the stars? They are the watchers. They see what we do. They do not choose sides." She nodded slowly. "And this feather?" Nantan's gaze softened. "That one is for your mother. The wind carries her. She will never be far." For a moment Clara couldn't speak. The desert seemed to hum around them. Crickets in the brush, the low sigh of wind between stones. The ache in her chest that she had carried for years began to shift, not vanish, but loosen. "Thank you," she whispered. Nantan inclined his head. "You are not my prisoner, Clara Whitfield," he said quietly. "You are my equal. The wife of a chief's son is not a servant." She speaks. She works beside him. She looked up sharply. "You mean that?" "Yes." His voice was steady. "My people do not ask a woman to bow. They ask her to stand." It was the first time in her life anyone had said that to her. She stared into the fire, thinking of Whitestone, of her father's commands, the whispers, the weight of expectations. For the first time, she realized how small her world had been. When she finally met his eyes again, there was a different kind of silence between them. Not fear, not distance, but the beginning of understanding. Later, as she lay beneath the endless stars, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, Clara looked at the cradle board resting beside her. The carvings caught the moonlight like silver veins. It was no longer just a gift. It was a message that peace wasn't something traded or forced. It had to be made. The way Nantan had carved each line, with patience, intention, and belief that something lasting could be born from brokenness. And as the desert wind whispered through the mesquite, Clara closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, slept without fear. When Clara opened her eyes the next morning, the desert was quiet, soft light spilling over the canyon walls, painting the world gold. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw Nantan crouched by the fire, stirring embers back to life, and the memory of the last 2 days returned. They broke camp early, traveling north through a country that seemed to breathe around them. As the land rose, the desert gave way to stands of juniper and pine. The air cooled, scented with resin and sage. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the strange peace that comes when one stops fighting the world long enough to listen to it. By evening, they reached the Apache settlement, a small cluster of lodges and adobe dwellings nestled between red cliffs. Smoke drifted lazily from the fires, and children's laughter echoed faintly through the air. It wasn't what Clara had expected. It wasn't savage or fearful. It was home. Nantan led her to a large round dwelling at the edge of camp. "This is ours," he said simply. Inside, the space was warm and welcoming. The walls were covered with woven mats painted in deep reds and browns. A clay pot simmered on the hearth, filling the air with the scent of herbs and corn. A few older women watched her from the doorway, curious but not unkind. One stepped forward, offered Clara a piece of soft bread, and spoke a few words in Apache that Nantan translated. She says, "Welcome. The fire is now yours too." Clara smiled, touched and overwhelmed all at once. "Tell her thank you." As days passed, she began to settle into the rhythm of this new life. The women taught her to grind corn, to weave reed baskets, to tend to the small garden by their home. Her hands learned quickly. She had worked all her life, and work was a language that needed no translation. At first she spoke little. Her Apache was halting, full of mistakes. But laughter bridged the gaps. Slowly the people warmed to her. The children followed her when she fetched water. The elders nodded to her when she passed. In the evenings, she and Nantan sat by the fire. He told her stories, not of war or blood, but of stars, rivers, and the spirits that watched over both their worlds. He spoke of his father, a leader who believed that true strength came not from the blade but from restraint. "Your people think we are wild," Nantan said one night. "But the wild is what teaches us balance. It reminds us that life is not to be owned." Clara listened, her fingers tracing the carved feather on the cradle board beside her. "Back home," she said softly, "we were always told to fight for what was ours." He looked at her, eyes glinting in the firelight. "And did you ever find peace that way?" She smiled sadly. "No." He nodded as if he'd expected that answer. As the weeks passed, word of Clara's life among the Apache began to drift back to Whitestone Crossing. Traders carried stories, that she was safe, that she worked beside her husband, that she laughed. At first, the townsfolk dismissed it as lies. But when Elias Whitfield himself rode north to see his daughter and returned alive, changed, the town began to murmur again, this time not in fear, but in curiosity. He spoke little of what he'd seen, only that Nantan had treated Clara with kindness, that she seemed at peace, and that the people there lived with more dignity than he'd been taught to believe possible. For Whitestone, those words were harder to swallow than bullets. Yet something began to shift. A few men left their rifles home when riding near the ridge. A few women began to send small gifts north: flour, cloth, salt. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was a start. Back in the canyon, Clara watched the children play beneath the wide blue sky. She had never felt so far from the world she'd known, yet never so close to belonging somewhere. When Nantan joined her, brushing dust from his hands, she turned to him and said almost in wonder, "They're not afraid of me anymore," he smiled. "No, you gave them reason not to be." She looked at him, the truth of it sinking in. It wasn't just her they'd accepted. It was the idea that two worlds could meet without destroying each other. And for the first time, the thought didn't feel impossible. The seasons turned gently in the canyon, and time, that relentless force, softened everything it touched. A year passed, then another. The once nervous girl from Whitestone Crossing became part of the rhythm of the Apache camp. Clara spoke the language now, her accent rough but her meaning clear. She laughed easily, worked hard, and carried herself with quiet grace. When the first spring rains came, she bore a child, a boy with dark eyes and pale curls, a living bridge between two worlds. The women sang for him, wrapping him in soft deer hide and laying him in the cradleboard Nantan had carved. The same cradleboard that had silenced an entire town now held the future it had promised. They named him Taza, meaning morning dew, for he had been born just as the dawn broke. Clara would never forget that morning. The scent of wet earth, the distant call of a hawk, the way Nantan had held their son and whispered a prayer in both Apache and English. He had said the same words twice, once to the spirits of his ancestors, once to the God Clara had grown up with. 2 prayers for 1 child, 2 worlds meeting over 1 small heartbeat. News of the birth reached Whitestone Crossing by midsummer. Elias Whitfield rode north again, this time not out of fear or duty but longing. When he arrived at the settlement, he dismounted slowly, his hat in his hands. Clara met him outside her home, Taza bundled in her arms. For a long time, father and daughter said nothing. Then Elias spoke, his voice unsteady. "He's beautiful." Clara smiled softly. "Would you like to hold him?" He hesitated, years of prejudice warring with something deeper, then nodded. She placed the child carefully in his arms. Elias looked down, his rough hands trembling slightly against the small, warm weight. "He's got your eyes," he murmured. "And Nantan's calm," she replied. Elias chuckled, the sound low and wistful. "Lord knows you never had much of that from me." For the first time in years, Clara laughed with her father. They spent 3 days together. Elias spoke with Nantan, ate with his people, and saw the life his daughter had built. Simple, honest, full of meaning. When he left, he didn't say goodbye with words. He simply pressed his hand to Nantan's shoulder and nodded, a gesture that meant "You have my trust." Back in Whitestone, things began to change slowly, quietly. Trade routes opened between the settlement and Nantan's camp. When Apache families came to town, they were met with caution, yes, but not hostility. Children who once played war in the dust now played tag together by the river. It wasn't peace written on paper. It was peace written in small acts of grace. Years later, when Clara told her son the story of how his parents met, she did not speak of forced marriage or fear. She told him about courage, about how sometimes peace begins when one person dares to see another not as enemy, but as human. When Taza was old enough, he carved too. His hands learned from Nantan, steady and strong. One summer, he brought a new cradleboard to his mother. This one smaller, simpler, yet carrying the same design. The river, the stars, and a single feather in the center. "For when my sister comes," he said, grinning. Clara traced the carving, tears rising in her eyes. "Your father will be proud," she whispered. Taza looked toward the horizon where the sun burned over the cliffs. "He already is." In time, word of the Whitfield woman who lived among the Apache spread across the frontier. Some told the story as legend, others as lesson. But for those who knew the truth, it was neither. It was a memory of what could happen when courage outgrew fear, and when travelers passed through Whitestone Crossing in the years that followed. They would still see that old cedar tree by the creek, now grown back, tall and strong. If they looked close, they might notice the faint carvings in its bark. A river, a star, and a feather, a reminder that one gift, born from love and understanding, had once silenced an entire town, and in doing so taught it how to listen.